I want to welcome everyone to the Free Enterprise Institute's 43rd Annual Founders Day Breakfast. I am Steve Kligowitz, Director of Academic Affairs at the Free Enterprise Institute. Let us begin with prayer, followed by the presentation of the colors, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the singing of the Star-Spangled Banner. I will now ask Dr. Robert Sloan, President of Houston Baptist University, to give the invocation. Please stand.
Pray with me, please. Father in heaven, we begin this day by giving you thanks for your great glory. We acknowledge that you alone are King, Creator, Sustainer, and Redeemer of all the earth. We bow before you. We thank you for the responsibilities you've given us as your children, to bear your image, to proclaim your sovereignty throughout all the earth, and to gather up the praises of the earth and offer them back to you. We ask, Father, for your forgiveness. We acknowledge that we have rebelled against your greatness and against your truth, that we have sinned. We thank you for the glorious redemption that we have found through Jesus Christ. We thank you for the hope that is ours, both in this age and in the age to come. We ask that we be great stewards of the responsibilities that you've given us, in keeping with the power of your Spirit and the truth of the gospel. Thank you for this occasion, for the food that we share, for the conversation, for the speakers, for the Free Enterprise Institute, for all the work that it does and that it inspires all of us to do in your name. We offer you our prayers through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Up, bow, face. Street, heart. Post. Colors.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Order. Heart. Center. Face.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hail at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
You may be seated. And please enjoy your breakfast. I'd like to thank Dr. Sloan for asking the blessings of our Creator on all gathered here. To the junior ROTC of the High School for Law and Justice, we thank you for helping us. And Josh Flynn, we are grateful for your many years of leading us in the national anthem. By the way, Josh, who is a trustee of the Harris County Department of Education and the current board president, is also a candidate for Texas House District 138. The Free Enterprise Institute was founded in 1976, led by our founding president, Rollin Story, who is joined by Lucy Eisenhower, Bert Watson, Walter Stockard, and Jim Wise. They dedicated the Institute to teaching young people, teachers, professors, and civic leaders about the blessings of a free and virtuous society. And you can look on page 8 of your program to read a fuller history of the Free Enterprise Institute. Among us this morning are students and teachers from area schools, including Western Academy, Magnolia School, St. Thomas Episcopal School, Houston Heights High School, Lutheran South Academy, Lutheran High North. And we have 3 schools in attendance whose students volunteered to help with the breakfast this morning. They helped you find your tables, and they were very pleasant guides, and I'd like to thank those schools, those students, the Constantine School, the Holy House Academy, and St. John the 23rd College Preparatory. The Free Enterprise Institute is committed to excellence in higher learning, and we partner with colleges and faculty that share our commitment, including these institutions that are here today. Houston Baptist University, of course, University of St. Thomas, and the Robert and Janice McNair Centers for Free Enterprise from Houston Baptist University and the University of St. Thomas. You may applaud. Now I would like to introduce Winston Elliott, who has served as president of the Free Enterprise Institute since 1992. Please welcome Winston.
I feel that I would be remiss on this most important of all days if I did not say, "Go Astros." I actually had planned this event this morning that Jose Altuve was going to lead us off, and we had a lower podium, but he was going to hit for power, and unfortunately, he's committed today. Those of you who aren't baseball fans, the Astros are in the World Series. It starts tonight. I was going to wear an Altuve jersey. I thought that would work, but orange didn't seem to fit with the occasion. But maybe now it's going to fit with all occasions as we go forward. In this, our 43rd year, the Free Enterprise Institute continues to teach the principles of free enterprise, constitutional government, public and private virtue, and we continue to do this through our local workshops and conferences for teachers, students, and college and academics. And we do this also through the educational lectures which we deliver throughout the year across the country. Of course, none of this is possible without the support of the donors and friends that we have had for so many years. This is my 28th breakfast as president. I originally got involved with the Institute in 1984. I think Steve mentioned to you that the founders founded the Institute in 1976, the year of our nation's bicentennial. And in about 1984, Rollin Story, who was the founding president, got me involved in the Institute. And then in 1992, I got a call from Bob McNair's office asking me to meet with Mr. McNair to talk about the Free Enterprise Institute. And I remember very distinctly, I had recently sold a company, and Bob was talking to me about the Institute and how we should grow. And I said, that's excellent, but I've just sold a company that I spent years building up, and I'm now playing tennis full time. Not well, but I was playing. And in the end, of course, Bob McNair said, I would like you to do this job. And so here I am, 27 years, or now 28 breakfasts later. This, thank you. This is our first breakfast since Mr. McNair passed at the end of last year. I have to admit it's kind of an odd feeling for me for my first 27 years sitting over here at the head table, waiting to come up here. I had Bob McNair whispering in my ear, often asking me if I was on time, because I often wasn't on time. And I always knew that Bob was going to come up here and give some amazing remarks. I know that many of us know Bob for his entrepreneurial success, of course for the Houston Texans. Maybe if people didn't know him personally, they thought of him as just a wealthy, successful businessman who had a tremendous spirit of generosity and caring for this community. He loved Houston, he loved Texas, and he loved the American Republic. And he lived that out in his life, in his philanthropy, in the people that he encouraged and supported, in his support of this institution for about 30 years, because he actually was involved for several years before he hired me. So I think it's definitely something that we should do to thank him and to remember him at this time, now that we're having our first breakfast without him. I think it was about 10 years ago, Bob called me up and he said, what do we have new? What do we have that's exciting, that's going on? We've got a lot of programs that we've done for almost since the beginning, working with teachers and students. What do we have new? And I said, well, we had this little thing. There's the internet, and evidently people use it to reach out, and we've created an online journal. And next thing I know, Bob said, well, I want to support that because we need to get the word out beyond Houston. And so 9 years ago, we started our online journal, The Imaginative Conservative, which is now 9 years old. Well, that was repetitive. But The Imaginative Conservative presents readers with thoughtful discussion of economics, politics, and the Western tradition. And it allows us to extend the work of our local conferences, workshops, and lectures to reach a worldwide audience. Now, I had no idea when Bob and I had that conversation about 9 years ago that the Imaginative Conservative will become the outreach tool that it has become for us in our work. We've now published 6,800 essays by some 1,200 authors that in those 9 years have been read over 19 million times. So we're very pleased that a conversation and a beginning can end up reaching 19 million people, and with the same principles that we offer here to students and teachers, and now have the opportunity to offer across the world. It's a little bit odd. We get contact from across the world of people who want to republish and translate our work. And so there is now a site in Romania that translates all of our essays into Romanian. I hope they do a good job of translation. I have no idea. They say they are, and I believe them. But the idea that now in Romania, they're reading the essays that we're generating from our offices here and from our writers who work around the country. We have mirror sites in Paris, mirror sites in Brazil who are also republishing our essays. So the outreach of this institute through this online journal has gone even beyond the outreach to our teachers and students locally. Today you're going to hear from 3 speakers who have given hundreds of lectures in our programs for teachers and students over the last 20 years. But they're also senior contributors and have written many essays for the Imaginative Conservative. So I hope that by the end of the morning, you will have gotten a feel for the kind of quality and inspiration that is offered by our work in our conferences and in our publications. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker for the morning, Joseph Pierce. Joseph first came to Houston to speak for us in 2002, and I think we were at what was then the Warwick Hotel, which I believe now is the Zaza over by the zoo. But we were doing a teachers conference there, and Joseph came in, and I had no idea that in 2002 we would be here 17 years later having these discussions. He is the author of 24 books, including The Quest for Shakespeare, Tolkien, Man and Myth, Wisdom and Innocence, A Life of G.K. Chesterton, and Solzhenitsyn, A Soul in Exile. Joseph has authored some 400 essays for our online journal, The Imaginative Conservative, and we are very pleased to welcome him for the first time to our breakfast here. So, Mr. Joseph Pearce.
Good morning. It's good to be here in Houston. And if you detect an accent, I just want to make it perfectly clear from the outset, I'm the only person in this room who does not have an accent. But I will do my best to understand you. So this is going to be a very brief talk within the theme of this morning's event, which is, if you like, the heroes and heroines who fought against the tyranny of the Soviet Union and of communism, and that Winston's asked me to speak on one of those heroes, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Back in 1998, I was honored to go out to his home just outside Moscow to interview him for the research for my book, one of the great moments of my life. But I'd like this morning to give just a brief talk based upon an editorial that I wrote for the St. Austin Review, which is a magazine that I edit, as well as writing for the Imaginative Conservative. I edit a magazine called the St. Austin Review, and this was originally published as an editorial, and I think it's the right sort of length to keep things brief here. The other thing about it, the other reason I wanted to use this is because it's about Winston. Not Winston Elliott, but Winston Smith. And those of you that have read 1984 by George Orwell will know that Winston Smith is the protagonist of that novel. And I want to, in this talk, I want to compare the real-life hero Solzhenitsyn with the fictional hero Winston Smith from 1984. It is over a century since the forces of secular fundamentalism unleashed an anti-Christian pogrom on the people of Russia. Declaring the liberation of man from God, the communists sought to murder the mass, replacing it with mass murder. In the following decades, tens of millions were sacrificed on the altars of atheism, as man, unshackled from the constraints of Christian morality, showed the horrific deadliness of his enlightenment. With perverse and infernal irony, men were slaughtered in the name of man. The seeming omnipotence of man was reinforced by the monolithic state, the political machine with which man crushed men. The man machine shoveled millions of men into death camps, feeding them like fodder to man almighty, the new god of materialism. This was the madness of Marxism, a madness that seemed to sweep the world before it in the first half of the last century. It seemed to be maddeningly charming, sweeping men off their feet and out of their heads. Its kiss was a curse, the kiss of death. In the midst of this Marxist maelstrom, a child was born. His name was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was much like any other child of the revolution. He was brainwashed by the man-machine's education program and became a clone of the system. He fought for the machine during the Second World War, idolizing Stalin, the self-styled steel man who was master of the machine. And he witnessed the raping and pillaging of Prussia as part of the steel man's bloodlustful revenge on the Germans. He then committed the heresy of criticizing the steel man in a letter to a friend. Denounced as a blasphemer against man, he was sent to prison, where he lost his faith in Almighty Man, and where he discovered for the first time the exiled God. Liberated from the slavery of subservience to a false god, Solzhenitsyn found his freedom whilst in prison. Turning his back on man, he learned to love men. The will made steel had been overthrown by the word made flesh. Later, after almost dying of cancer, he found life in his near-death experience. It was this near-death experience that led to his final conversion to Christianity. In his death was his resurrection. Now, aided by the risen God, he was ready to harrow hell itself. He was only one small man, seemingly powerless against the Soviet system. But aided by the God-man, he was ready to take on the might of the man-machine. Almost single-handedly and almost miraculously, this one man would play a major role in the overthrow of man almighty, at least in its Soviet incarnation. His devastating exposés of the horrors of communism in works such as One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich and the monumental Gulag Archipelago undermined the very faith foundations of Marxism. His books and the living example of his courageous resistance against the machine's efforts to crush him served as a beacon of light penetrating to the heart of the darkness. Today, after the machine has ground to a halt and after the statues of the still man have been ignominiously toppled, it is easy to forget the enormity of Solzhenitsyn's achievement. Quite simply, what he did was considered to be impossible. It was beyond belief that one man could defy the communist state and survive. It was even more unbelievable that he should not only survive, but that he should play a significant role in the state's downfall and that he should outlive the state itself. Solzhenitsyn's life and example flew in the face of the reality of the realists. The destiny of the small man who dared defy the man-machine was epitomized in the eyes of most pessimistic realists by the example of Winston Smith in George Orwell's novel 1984. Orwell's novel was published in 1948 when Solzhenitsyn was serving his sentence as a political prisoner of the Soviet regime. As such, the figure of Winston Smith can be seen as being not merely a figure of every man in his alienation from the man-machine, also known as Big Brother, but as an unwitting figure of Solzhenitsyn himself. According to the realistic view, Winston Smith would not only be crushed by the machine, he would also betray every ideal and everything he loved in abject surrender to the almighty state. The triumph of Big Brother was inevitable. It was preordained. It was fate, and to deny and defy fate was fatal and futile. The fact is that Orwell had failed to shake off the Hegelian determinism of his Marxist past. He had long since become disillusioned with Marxism, but still believed that the forces of history were immutable and the triumph of the man-machine inevitable. Orwell still believed, like his former comrades, that the man-machine was omnipotent. He only differed from them to the extent that he hated the omnipotent God, whereas they admired it. Solzhenitsyn, on the other hand, did not believe that the machine was a god, but merely a dragon or a demon, a manifestation of evil. He did not believe in fate, but in freedom, the freedom of the will and its responsibility to serve the truth. Fate was a figment of the imagination, but the dragon was real. Furthermore, it was the duty of the good man to fight the dragon, even unto death if necessary. Solzhenitsyn fought the dragon, even though it was thousands of times bigger than he was, and even though it breathed fire and killed millions of people. He fought it because in conscience he could do nothing else. In doing so, he proved that faith, not fate, is the final victor. Faith can move mountains. It can move machines that were thought to be gods. It can move and remove Big Brother. Solzhenitsyn has rewritten George Orwell's novel using the facts of his life as his pen. He represents the victory of Winston Smith. And that's not all. He is also living proof that St. George slays the dragon, that David slays Goliath, and that Jack slays the giant. The saints are alive, the Bible is true, and fairy stories are more real than so-called realistic novels. Truth is not only stranger than fiction, it has a happier ending. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. I think you can see why Joseph is a very popular speaker in our programs and also has a great power in his words, which come across in our publications. And I appreciate the opportunity to have you here with us today and to have Solzhenitsyn honored today. And we do have Joseph's book, his biography of Solzhenitsyn, from his interviews with Solzhenitsyn out on the book table. It is part of our theme for today to talk about the heroes of freedom, and Joseph certainly just did with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, but I think we also want to recognize the heroes that we have in our midst, both the many young students we have with us. We're very glad to have so many schools represented, the heroes to be, the donors and friends and supporters of this organization who are helping them to learn the lessons of freedom. And also the people who I'm very proud to say are the people who have stood up to serve the Republic. We have folks in this room like Judge Edith Jones, good friend of our institution and a very important and wise judge in my view. We have Jack Cagle, who came through the program of our student programs back when he was in high school. And Jack, that was a long time ago, but still, you have remembered the lessons of freedom and now serve as Harris County Commissioner. And then we have someone like Josh Flynn, who served his country in the United States Marine Corps, then came back here and is now serving on the Harris County Board of Education, and has now announced that he's running for state representative. I think it's important that these folks be recognized because we live in a time when one of our particular goals is to teach public virtue, the idea of serving the Republic and the state and the city that we live in. And quite often, today it seems to be a cynical view. In Plato's Meno, they're talking about virtue, and Socrates asks Meno, what is virtue? And Meno's answer is public virtue is helping your friends, harming your enemies, and making sure everything that is good happens to yourself. I was leading a class, matter of fact, 3 classes at Houston Baptist University a few weeks ago in the Honors College, and I had the students read that out loud. Harm your friends, help your enemies, and basically take care of yourself. Harm your enemies, help your friends, and take care of yourself, which is much more shocking when you say it correctly. And I actually found it very difficult. These are very good students, students of clearly of character and serious students, and I found it very difficult to get them upset about the idea, which I was trying to work them up a little bit, about the idea that someone seeking public office would have their goal to be to harm their enemies, help their friends, and serve themselves. That's not the definition of public virtue, is it? That's not what Edith Jones does. It's not what Jack Cagle does. It's not what Ted Cruz, who's on our board, does. It's not what Josh Flynn does. I think we have to hold these goals much higher. And we have to try to help students understand that saying that public virtue is to merely harm your enemies, help your friends, and take care of yourself, that is not good. So if we can remember Solzhenitsyn, if we can remember the heroes, both even in our own communities, who are willing to make sacrifices and service for the good of freedom, in our case, for the good of the Republic, for the good of the state of Texas, that has value. So I thank you, Joseph, for your reminding us of what a hero of freedom is. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Brad Birzer. Brad Birzer, when I first met Brad, he was recommended to me. He spoke for us at first time in 1995. He was still a grad student. He had no gray hair at that point. And I did not know that in 1995 we'd be beginning a relationship that would carry on this way for so long. We have had the wonderful pleasure of having Brad give hundreds of lectures in our programs for teachers and students. He's also a member of our Board of Trustees, and he's chairman of our Academic Advisory Board. He holds the Russell Amos Kirk Chair in History at Hillsdale College and is a fellow of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. Brad is the author of 7 books, including In Defense of Andrew Jackson, Russell Kirk, American Conservative, and J.R.R. Tolkien's Sanctifying Myth, Understanding Middle-earth. Brad has also authored some 650 essays for our online journal. So we said earlier there's 6,800, almost 10% of them written by Brad Birzer over the last 9 years. So he's been very committed to our outreach online. And so it is my pleasure to introduce my friend, a friend of this institute, Dr. Brad Birzer.
Good morning, everybody. Such a great treat to be here. I left Michigan yesterday, late afternoon. I had 2 classes yesterday morning, and I wanted to teach. And when I left, it was raining and about 53 degrees. So, but yet when I landed in Houston last night, it was pretty nice. So, it was great. Anyway, thank you so much for all of this. I want to thank Winston for that very, very gracious introduction. And it is amazing to me when I look back at my own career. I'm 52 now. And I have been at Hillsdale College for 20 years, but I've been affiliated with the Free Enterprise Institute for 24. I mean, these are my 2 great institutional loves. So, and I calculated quickly in my head, we have this online journal that reaches anywhere from 10 to 20,000 people a day. And in that online journal, I've written almost 1 million words over the last 9 years. I think that's a disease. But it's a good one to have. So I'm very, very glad to be here. I really can't imagine my career or my profession or any of my works at all without Winston and the Free Enterprise Institute. So I want to begin by thanking the Free Enterprise Institute and Winston and Steve and Eileen and LaDawn and Connor for everything they've done. It's great to be a part of this. And I can say that in the other travels that I've had, Winston mentioned that we have this following in Romania. We also have followings, I think he mentioned, in Brazil, in Denmark, and in Poland, which is pretty amazing. I mean, there's actually a school of thought in Denmark called the Imaginative Conservative that's named after Winston's website. That's pretty stunning to think about that. And we're rivaling now National Review and some of the other big conservative publications. Well, today I want to talk about the second of 3 great figures. So Joseph brilliantly talked about Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who of course was our great prophet of the era. We also had a great priest, John Paul II, and I would like to talk about the third, the great king, Ronald Reagan. And I use these terms not lightly. I really do believe that in 1989 we were given a priest, a prophet, and a king. Never could we have all 3 offices in one. That can only happen twice, right? Once with Melchizedek and once with Christ. But we're not going to have that again, but we can see those offices distributed in a variety of different ways. And when I think about someone like Ronald Reagan, our 40th president of the United States, president from 1981 to 1989, I am always reminded of what it means to be an American. I was in 7th grade when Ronald Reagan was elected president, and I was a senior in college when the wall came down. I was very much a child of the 1980s, and Ronald Reagan was always my hero. I will never, ever forget the kind of heroism that he inspired, not only for me, but my friends as well. We all recognized that we were living in the midst of greatness. We knew that. And of course, Reagan carried that off so beautifully, not because he thought he was great, but because he thought he had purpose. And what a difference, right? Not someone who was full of himself, but someone who realized that he should make others full of themselves in the sense of actually working towards some goal. So when I think of the best of America, I think of liberty, I think of thoughtfulness, but I also think of this great character that Ronald Reagan had, and yet he did it with humility. He had audacity. This audacity to challenge what was wrong. So much of what Winston just talked about from the Meno and from what we saw with Socrates. Do we challenge what is wrong? Do we live with Socrates and say that we are willing to hate what ought to be hated and to love what ought to be loved? One of my favorite writers, Russell Kirk, tried to describe Ronald Reagan this way. He said, for all of his power of will, Ronald Reagan has been honored lately. He wrote this in 1981, just right before Ronald Reagan took the oath of office. He has had already the audacity to declare that this American republic will endure and thrive. He has been sufficiently bold to set his face against the prophets of decay. And with the old Roman republicans, he knows that audacity is a bulwark and that fortune both fears and favors the audacious. The American Republic commenced with audacity. If that audacity is exhausted, the Republic must end. Ronald Reagan, the audacious American stage manager just now, is not disposed to let fall that iron curtain of national destiny. For him, the American drama is not yet played out. Now, I'd like to take us back to 1980 and 1981 and try and remember, for those of us in the room who were there at the time, how utterly depressing the years of the late 1970s were. We had stagflation. We had just left and betrayed Vietnam and Cambodia, and also had left, by the way, Laos as well. We had been promised that containment against the Soviet Union would work, and yet during the 1970s, communism spread into Mozambique, into Angola, into Afghanistan, into Nicaragua, into Cambodia and Vietnam and Laos. So everything that we'd been promised in the 1950s and the 1960s was completely falling apart. And then you can imagine, we get to the very late 1970s, and we have the Iranian Revolution, and of course, the takeover of the embassy there and the taking of our hostages. This was a terrible time. In every way, this was a terrible time. National morale was at one of the lowest points that it had ever been at. And yet, when Ronald Reagan came forth, as Russell Kirk said, with this audacity, he said something that was profoundly true and yet as simple as can be. The only thing necessary for hope is hope. This is what hope is, right? This is what matters. And Reagan gave us that hope. And that hope is what I want to talk about today, that beauty that Reagan was able to impart to the American people. Now, when he came into office in January of 1981, there was a long background there to his own thoughtfulness. This was a man, and we've been able to prove this over and over again since his passing, and now that his notes have become available, not just his 4x5, but his 3x5, his 4x6, his 3x5 cards. We've been able to now translate his shorthand. We have diaries, we have letters from Ronald Reagan. They are immense in every way, and they are detailed, and we know that this is a man who read constantly. This is a man who thought constantly. Remember when we were told he was just an amiable dunce? It was the people reporting that who were the dunces, and I'm not sure they were too amiable. Reagan was brilliant in his own way, and he understood exactly what he needed to get done and what America needed to get done. We know that as early as 1963, he had already outlined in his private notes a way to bring down the Soviet Union without war. And he kept honing those notes. He wasn't even governor of California yet when Reagan was sitting around playing fantasy Cold War. And he's writing down in these notes, how do we go about doing this? How can we pressure them? And his argument was a very simple and yet profound argument. The Soviet Union, by its very internal logic, is so anti-humane that its days are already numbered. Now, can you imagine saying that in 1963? Or even in 1981 when Reagan did say that, and he was mocked, he was ridiculed for saying something that was seemingly so foolish, and yet Reagan understood. He said, any time that we Americans unleash our creativity, we will defeat the Soviets at every level. This is not a struggle of one materialism against another materialism. This is the struggle for the human spirit, Reagan said. The Soviets have done nothing but crush that human spirit. We Americans from day one have done our best to enliven the American spirit. We're the first country in the Western world to go against slavery. We were the first country to declare all people being created equal. All of these things Reagan said were innovations, and yet they were innovations towards what was good and true and beautiful. And then we see Reagan in 1977, where he's meeting with his advisor, Dick Allen, and they are talking about strategy, how to win the Cold War. Reagan, of course, had just lost the nomination for the Republican presidential candidacy, and it would be not until 1980 that he would actually be able to run again. But when Dick Allen asked Reagan, well, what's your theory on the Soviet Union? He said, my theory is this, Dick. The Cold War is that we will win and they will lose. What do you think about that, Dick? That's pretty amazing, right? We'll win, they lose. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, in 1980, Ronald Reagan, of course, comes to the presidency, takes the oath of office in early January of 1981, and what happens within the first 2 months of his presidency, which really wasn't going that well in the first 2 months. Reagan was doing everything possible, scrambling to get everything put together in his administration. Of course, we have a young crazy man, John Hinckley, who does everything possible to assassinate the president and comes very, very, very close. And I still remember very clearly in 7th grade when the principal of Liberty Junior High in Hutchinson, Kansas, came over the intercom and announced that President Reagan had been assassinated. He was dead. We found out later, of course, that was not the case, but that was the word that went out across America. We now know that Reagan, the moment that he recovered, and he had a very quick recovery, the man was in incredible shape despite the brutality of that bullet, he wrote in his diary right after his recovery, whatever happens now, I owe my life to God, and I will do everything to serve him in every way that I can. That was not an empty promise by any means. And I had the great privilege, I mentioned to you earlier that I've said twice now, that I was in 7th grade when Ronald Reagan came to the presidency. My oldest brother, Kevin, graduated from the University of Notre Dame that spring. So he was 22 at the time. He was graduating, and Ronald Reagan was asked to give the graduation address. March 17th, 1981. This was the very first time Reagan had appeared in public and had given a public address after the assassination attempt. I remember, even as a kid, seeing him on stage. He looked huge. Later, I found out because he was wearing full body armor in his chest, and obviously, that was one reason he looked so great. But any of you who've studied Reagan, and I don't mean to make this sound inappropriate, but Reagan worked out so much after the bullet that from ages 71 to 73, he added 2 inches of muscle to his chest. That's pretty good. I'm not sure I could do that at 52. Let's hope I can do that at 71. So anyway, Reagan was incredible about this. And the speech that he gave, and I will never forget it, this was one of the great kind of political moments of my life. The speech that he gave was a tour de force in which he told us, and I will only read 2 quotes from it, but he told us exactly what does it mean to have hope. And this is what he said. He said, we need you. We need your youth. We need your strength. We need your idealism to help make all that is right, that is wrong. Now, I know that at this period in your life, you have been and are critically thinking about the mores and customs of the past, and you're questioning their values. Every generation does this. But may I suggest that you don't discard the time-tested values upon which civilization was built simply because they are old. It's good advice. And then he says, I promise you, now remember, 1981, the years ahead are great ones for this country, for the cause of freedom and the spread of civilization. The West will no longer contain communism. It will transcend communism. It won't bother to denounce it. It will dismiss it as some bizarre aberration and chapter in human history whose last pages are even now being written. Well, that was Reagan's very first pronouncement against the Soviet Union during his presidency. And those were powerful 10 words that changed the foreign policy of America, because up to that point, everything that the United States had done against the Soviets from 1946 forward had been materialist containment against materialist containment. And Reagan identified exactly what needed to be done. We must challenge them not at the level of material things, but at the spiritual level. We must show them that we have a God, that we have law, and that our society is based on creativity, goodness, truth, and beauty. And I'm not going to tell the story. Barbara Elliott can tell this story so beautifully, and I will let her tell the story. But I can't end without us thanking God for Ronald Reagan, one of, I think, the 3 greatest presidents that we have had in American history. He was absolutely the right man at the right time, who did the right thing when the right thing absolutely needed to be done, but was not easy to do at all. Reagan was that great figure. I want to thank you all for having me speak today. I want to thank you all for supporting the Free Enterprise Institute, for supporting Winston and ideas that we have here, like those of Ronald Reagan. And I would now like to turn it over to Barbara Elliott, who will give our final, or to Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. That was fantastic. And I do want to move right along to our main speaker, Barbara Elliott, who is scholar in residence and assistant professor in the Honors College of Houston Baptist University. She is the author of 5 books, including Street Saints, Renewing America's Cities. Barbara founded the Work Faith Connection, which has now transitioned more than 5,000 people from prison, homelessness, and unemployment into a new job and new life. Barbara also served President Ronald Reagan in the White House and then reported television news from Europe for PBS. Later, Barbara interviewed more than 100 people behind the Iron Curtain to find out what led to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Her book, Candles Behind the Wall, Heroes of the Peaceful Revolution That Shattered Communism, reveals that this was no ordinary revolution. And by the way, a new edition of Candles Behind the Wall will be coming out soon. And if you would like to sign up to be notified when the book is available, there's a form at our book table where you can put your name down and be notified. And also on your tables, there's a form. So you don't even have to go to the book table, and you'll be notified when Candles comes out in this great new edition. As the Berlin Wall fell, Barbara launched a private initiative to help people fleeing communism. For these efforts and her outreach to America's homeless, Barbara received the Eleanor Roosevelt Award for Human Rights from President George W. Bush in 2001. Please welcome Barbara Elliott.
Thank you, Steve, for that lovely introduction. He made it so complimentary because he still owes me for introducing to his wife. Got him a good one, too. And thank you, Winston, for having me here. It's kind of a risky thing putting your spouse on the program. Now, the reason he did that is not because he loves me, which he does, but because I was there when the Berlin Wall came down, and that 30th anniversary is something we celebrate this fall, and it's worth celebrating. It was an event that really changed the course of the 20th century, and it freed 400 million people, and scarcely a shot was fired. That is not a normal revolution. Now, we have a lot of students here this morning, which is wonderful, So I'm going to give you just a mini historical framework for my remarks, maybe for some of the rest of you guests too, who weren't alive then. Let me give you a very brief one. So at the end of the Second World War, the Allied forces still had to administer the countries that the Nazis had taken over. So Russia was our ally, and the Central Eastern European countries were put under their control. They were supposed to give them free elections and transition them back into being free countries. Well, that did not happen. Russia simply grabbed them, imposed its totalitarian form of government on them, and snatched all of those hundreds of millions of people who basically lost the Second World War twice. Communism was deadly serious about crushing any opposition. To impose their ideology, the communists in the 20th century killed 200 million of their own civilians worldwide. Let me say that again. The communists in the 20th century worldwide killed 200 million of their own civilians to impose their ideology. They stripped away all the existing law, all the existing property rights, all the existing freedom of speech and religion, and they enforced a reign of terror. So that's the end of the history lesson. No quiz later, you're fine. So here's where my story intersects this story. Right after President Reagan was elected in 1980, he appointed me to the Office of Public Liaison, and it was an honor to serve him there. I later was in Europe, and I became a reporter for PBS television, reporting economic and political news. I was based in Germany, so as these events were going on in Germany, the Cold War was getting hot. We were stationing the Pershing missiles, NATO was, in response to the Soviet SS-20s that were aimed at European cities, and there was a lot of nervousness. So, as a television reporter, I could see the economic and the political considerations of all of these events because that's what we do. And that's the grid through which all news fits, right? Economics and politics. If it doesn't fit through that grid, it's not news. You can't even see it. Then something happened that changed me. In the summer of 1989, there was a huge wave of people who had come through somehow and gotten over to freedom in the western side. 300,000 of them had ended up in West Germany, and there were just too many people for the government, too many people for the Red Cross, just too many people. And there was not enough care for them. They put them in shelters everywhere. So I had been living in a world of political power and aristocracy. I was a baroness living in a villa, and I'm nobbing with diplomats and thinking I'm quite grand. Then I woke up one morning, I looked in the mirror and said, I don't even know who you are. I was a little rusty on praying, but I said, God, I've done it my way, and it looks good on the outside, but I know that my life has not yielded anything of any lasting value. And I said, if you can make my life a witness to you, please do. So he met me there, and he started remaking me. There was a lot of work to be done. I'm still a work in progress. But he began to show me that life could be different. I read a lot of scripture. I was discipled by some really wonderful women. So 2 years later, I'm all soaked in scripture. I'm all prayed up, and I'm saying, okay, Lord, now what do you want me to do? And he gave me an answer I was not expecting. Refugees. Refugees, I'm thinking. I don't know how to do refugees. I do dinner parties. I did not say that to God. So I obeyed. I went to shelters near us in Cologne, Germany, with one friend and began reaching out to the people there. I mean, there were people there who had dodged bullets, swum rivers, carried their children on their shoulders, and had gotten to freedom in the West. They needed doctors, they needed a place to live, they needed jobs. I tutored their children, I took a family home with me. A lot of other people did the same. But about the time the Berlin Wall opened, then there's a huge wave of people, even more than that. So millions and millions of people coming over to our side. So I had hundreds of conversations with all of these people, and they told me what their lives had been like. They told me about their fears. They told me about the terror of the Stasi or the KGB persecuting them. They told me what their life had been like under this repressive, cruel, totalitarian government. I didn't understand that part of communism until I had listened to the people who had lived in it. So a few months into this project, then God, with the same clarity, says, all right, now go tell the stories of my faithful people who stayed. And I'm thinking, right, I don't speak all of those languages, but it was like, go. So I got nudged out the door, and I went. I went to Poland, I went to Hungary, I went to people who are from Czechoslovakia, I went to East Germany, I went to Russia a number of times, and talked with people who had contributed to what ultimately was a peaceful revolution. The book that came out of that was Candles Behind the Wall. It was an interesting process getting these stories. So my interpreter in Moscow told me that she was third generation KGB. I'm thinking, great. This is when she brings a wire out and, kills me in the back seat of the car. I was worried about getting the tape cassettes where all the interviews, getting them out of the country. The law was a little fluid at this time in the Wild East. So I stuffed them into my suitcase and I prayed, okay, Lord, you have made blind eyes see, now make seeing eyes blind. So the customs agent opens my suitcase, rummages around, jumps on a little jewel box, just a few pieces of jewelry, says, aha, we have caught you smuggling. Opens it up and chews it and bangs it on. He realizes it's just costume jewelry, nothing valuable. So in disgust, he flings it back in the suitcase and waves me through. That worked so well, I did that every single trip. And every time, it's a different guy who falls for the same thing. It was wonderful. So after several hundred conversations with people from the East Bloc, I discovered that this was a revolution of the spirit. That didn't fit through my grid at all. Economics, politics, right? It doesn't fit. And I couldn't have seen it unless I had seen the people who had lived it. Now, at that time, everybody is reporting Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Mikhail Gorbachev. Those were the heroes in this story. Later, a few of them added in the Pope. But at this time, nobody was looking at this other dimension, this revolution of the spirit, but at the grassroots level. There were people there who, because of their faith in God, were willing to stand up and simply burn with the truth, burn with their faith. They were like candles. Their light, the light of their convictions, would then ignite somebody else and give them the courage to stand up too. And as one candle lit another, the darkness began to recede. I discovered that this was a conflict in the realm of the spirit. I couldn't have seen it before, and I nearly missed it. Almost everybody else missed it too. But I discovered that there were amazing, courageous people who, at a moment of crisis, simply stood up. So, example like Shirin Aidosova. So during the attempted coup in Russia in 1991, the tanks are rolling into Moscow. And the fledgling democracy is in their White House, the building where the parliament met, and the tanks are rolling up. She goes up to one of the tanks and bangs on the side of it. Bam, 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 bam. And the driver of the tank pops at top of it. What? She hands him a Bible. And she says, it says here not to kill. Are you going to kill me? And she puts herself right in front of his tank. Well, no, at that moment he wasn't going to kill her. He hadn't thought about it in that way, that it was going to be a real person saying, don't do this. But he took the Bible. Most people had not even seen one. She joined a number of people, 4 of them that I talked to, who took a shipment of Bibles they had just gotten the night before from the American Bible Society. Go figure. They loaded up crates, and all of them spread out and gave Bibles to the tank drivers, one at a time, and engaged them in a conversation, and begged them not to shoot their people, their own people. And in the end, those tank drivers refused the orders to roll over these people who would then form a human chain all around the White House. I discovered that in every country there was a core of people who, because of their convictions, wanted change. They wanted a peaceful revolution, though, and they vowed not to return evil with evil. And as they spoke the truth of Christ into what Solzhenitsyn called the culture of the lie, the darkness receded. Let me tell you about another one of these candles that I discovered. Rüdiger Knechtel was a border guard in East Germany, right after the Berlin Wall was built in 1961. The next year, the first person was shot trying to get across it. So Rüdiger is stationed right there on that spot where that person had been shot. And people could see across from the western side, so they'd yell over to him, "Hey, did you shoot him?" And he'd look around and he'd go, "No, I wouldn't shoot him." But he had to think about that. Would he actually shoot one of his countrymen trying to make a break to go over to freedom in the West? And he wrestled with himself and finally decided, no, I'm not going to shoot my countrymen. So he talks to the other guys in his unit. They're all 19 years old, right? They all got drafted. And they had this conversation and finally said, no, this is wrong. So they agreed that they are all going to shoot to miss or just not shoot at all. Well, he thinks this is such a splendid idea that he puts a note in a milk bottle, tosses it across the side to the west, asking them to drop leaflets all along the border, asking all of the East German soldiers not to shoot. Well, that did not go unnoticed. The authorities came, picked him up, picked up the other men in his company. All of them got a kind of a mock trial, and they all went to prison for 2 years. Rüdiger, in that time, had a wife who was being visited by the Stasi, who convinced her to divorce him while he's in prison. They told his son that his father was a criminal, a terrible man, he should never have anything to do with him. So when Rüdiger gets out 2 years later, he's lost his wife and his son, the two people who mattered most to him, and he has nothing. The price of doing the right thing was sometimes very high. I'll put this here. There were people like Rüdiger all over the East Bloc countries who simply at a moment of crisis stood up. Sometimes there were a lot of them. There were rebellions in East Germany and Poland in 1954, in Hungary in 1956, and in Czechoslovakia in 1968. And every one of them ended with tanks and bullets and thousands of people being put in prison. President Reagan resisted communism with every fiber of his being. Thank you, Brad, for the things that you said about him. He threw down the gauntlet and said early in his presidency that communism would end on the ash heap of history. He resisted communism at three levels, the military, the political, but also the moral and spiritual. He knew that America needed to bargain from a position of strength, so he authorized the expenditures for weapons, but he also negotiated arms reduction. He had, however, a real sense of the moral aspect of communism, and when he called it the evil empire, all the sophisticated Europeans kind of laughed. The dissidents who were in prison in Russia cheered when they heard him say that because they knew that he was absolutely speaking the truth. And they particularly loved it when he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." People on both sides of it cheered that day. Let me tell you about another one of my favorite candles who cheered for Reagan that day. Alexander Ogorodnikov was a student of cinematography, and when he was making a film about Christians who worshiped in the woods so they would not be persecuted by the KGB, he got tossed out of the university because that was an unacceptable subject for a Soviet university. He started a group called the Christian Seminar. He gathered a number of Russian Orthodox intellectuals, and they together wanted to live their faith authentically. They really resented the fact that the Orthodox Church had been capped in what it was able to do in terms of bringing their faith into the society. Alexander said it was like having to leave your faith like a piece of luggage at the door of the church when you walked out. Charitable works were forbidden. Going into prisons as a chaplain was forbidden. All of the kinds of things that we take for granted, educating children in the faith, all of those were forbidden. Well, Alexander and those in the Christian seminar wanted to change that. So he goes from city to city encouraging people, and of course the KGB begins to take an interest in him. And they told him to stop, and he said, I will not. So he learns spycraft. He goes underground. And he teaches the other leaders of the Christian seminar as well. So they learn to slip a letter with a deft move under a cushion, or put a slash of lipstick on a wall to indicate a pickup point for things. They learned really to communicate with each other in different cities like spies do, except, oh, they're spies for the Lord. Wonderful. He had this kind of ebullient personality that simply would not take no for an answer. And when the KGB told him they would give him a passport to leave for Switzerland, just shut up and get out, they said, he said no. So he met with his friends. They debated this back and forth and said, no, you need to leave. And he said, I must live my faith with my flesh and blood as a witness for Christ. Pardon me for these lofty words, but I must do this for him. Well, they had tears rolling down their face because they knew what this meant. The KGB did, in fact, pick him up. They put him in prison where he was beaten, where he was starved, where they put him into a freezing prison cell with very little clothing. He was so hungry at one point, he said he had hallucinations of plucking his eyeballs out and eating them. When he would pray, the prison guards would scream at him not to, and then he would continue praying. So they pumped human excrement into his prison cell, so he had nowhere to lie down to sleep. One day, Alexander had been transported to a prison across the way on the eastern side of the Soviet Union. And he wore a cross, and one of the prison guards wanted to make an example of him. So 2,000 prisoners are called out into their yard. And this prison guard calls him up and says, you, come here. He says, take off your cross. And Alexander says very politely, no, this is the symbol of my faith, and I must obey the Lord more than man. And the guard says, take off your cross. And he smacks him across the face. And Alexander says, I am no one, but I am a son of the Lord, and he will not be humiliated. So if you are against me, you are against him. I warn you. So with that, the guard began beating him, raining down blows. Alexander hangs onto the cross. Well, they dragged him off into a cell block where 5 men then began hailing down blows on him. And as he is praying out loud, the guard that had started this with him says, you don't pray to your Lord, you pray to me. I am your Lord. Unable to get this cross any other way, Alexander at this point puts it in his mouth. They're pounding him. They then sprayed a kind of a spray in the room to get him to choke it out. They hadn't thought about the fact that they were in that room too, so pretty soon they're all choking. He hangs onto the cross. They decided then they would put handcuffs on him, so they did, and threw him down to the ground and jumped on his wrists with their full body force, again and again. He passed out from the pain. He woke up in his prison cell a few hours later. Cross is gone. His arms are swollen. He can't even feel anything in his hands. And some prisoners 2 cells down knew what had happened. They'd all seen it. One of them decided that they would do something about it. So he takes off his sock, although it was very cold, and unravels the yarn, and then begins to fashion a small cross, making knots, little tiny knots, until it finally makes a cross. So he took a tube of paper, and he puts it inside there, and then he uses the construction of the prison cells to his advantage. He gets on the shoulders of 2 of the other prisoners, puts the cross in the tube, stands up and blows it like a blow dart. It goes through the opening above the rooms, right through the thing where the electric wires go, and pew, right down into his lap. He had been without his cross exactly 3 hours. Now, the prison guard who had started this whole thing with Alexander is suddenly stricken ill. He was a very buff man who was very proud of his physique, and suddenly he had an ailment that nobody in the infirmary could cure. They took him to Moscow. They couldn't cure him there. So 2 months later, Alexander hears the sounds of a military dirge as they are carrying the coffin by of this guard who had said, "You pray to me, I am your Lord." After that, Alexander said, none of the prison's guards touched him. The Soviet Union tried to impose its rule with fear and terror. They threatened critics with prison or death, and that's why I am so surprised to hear that so many young people today are thinking that socialism or communism would be a good thing for America. They really need to look at the record, where it's been put into practice. Communism only works with force. That's the part that young people today need to know. The history of socialism and communism is written in blood. Whittaker Chambers was a communist, but he had a change of heart, and he emerged to tell his story in a book called Witness. I really recommend it. If you'd like to read that, find out about it. Anybody who thinks America needs communism should see what he said. He said there are two faiths that have been on trial in the 20th century, faith in God and faith in man. Communism is a vision of man without God. Anatoly Rudenko was a brilliant student of economics at a Russian university. He was told to join the Komsomol. It's a group for young people, students. The only problem is you have to swear allegiance to the Communist Party, and Anatoly had become a Christian, so he said he could not. Now, he wasn't just a Christian, he was a Baptist, and that was being like a cockroach in Russia. No kidding. I mean, they had no sense of humor about Baptists whatsoever. I can say that because I work at a Baptist university. Come on. He decided that it was worth being booted out of the university to hold true to his faith. So he goes to another university, way on the other side of Russia. He's a great student, does very well. The same thing. They say, you've got to join the Komsomol. And he said, no. And he realized at this point it was futile, so he said, all right, I will get up on a public stage and give my reasons and explain my faith and why I can't do this. So he did. And he knew he had no chance of ever getting an education after that, so he goes back home to his hometown. He repairs refrigerators and kind of ekes out a living. Well, one day there comes knock, knock, knock at his door. KGB showed up and hauled him away to a Soviet psychiatric prison. Why a psychiatric prison, you might ask? Because their reasoning was this: if somebody has been raised in a communist system and they have learned Marxism and atheism from the time they are 5 years old, if they don't believe it, they must be insane. There's no other explanation. So these Soviet psychiatric prisons were to take sane people and essentially make them insane. He walked into this place and saw people rolling imaginary balls. Some were drooling. Some had been tied to beds and were there lying in their own excrement. Some people were injected with a substance that would raise the body temperature to 105 degrees very quickly, which, by the way, will fry your brain. He looked at all of this and was terrified, and he prayed. And the only reason he could tell me this story is that the Baptists in Russia contacted the Baptist Union in America, who in turn contacted President Reagan, who in turn contacted Mikhail Gorbachev, and he was released. A lot of other people were not as fortunate. The communists did everything in their power to silence people of faith. That's why it was so surprising that they permitted the visit of John Paul II to Poland in 1979. When he came there, his visit literally would change the course of history. George Weigel's biography, Witness to Hope, is a wonderful, long rendition of his life. When he appeared there, he's on this huge stage, a 50-foot cross. 1 million people had packed into every near street. So he addresses all of them. Edward Gierek, the Polish premier, is in a hotel room overlooking the square, looking at this kind of nervously. I mean, what's he going to say? What can he say? When Pope John Paul II spoke, it was not a political message at all. What he did was remind people who they were. They were children of God, created in his image, with rights and duties and responsibilities, but also a particular case, a particular place in history. And he asked them, are we capable of this? Are we capable of living this responsibly? And as people recognize what he's saying, they begin to applaud. There's a spatter. Then there's more, and they realize this is the affirmation of their faith. They can say it this way. So the applause builds and builds. 14 minutes. People are speaking their faith for the first time in 40 years, and they grew stronger with every clap. He sees this and realizes this is a moment for teaching. So he emphasized again and again over the next 9 days, do this responsibly. Do what you do with dignity, live with restraint. And in his message, they would transcend communism. Of course, that made him a target for the Soviet Union. May 13th, 1981, in St. Peter's Square, a Bulgarian assassin shot 5 bullets at him. Investigations since have concluded that the KGB must have ordered that assassination attempt. 2 former CIA directors are on record of that, and also an Italian investigation. There were people who were endangered all over the East Bloc. There were spark plugs in different cities. One of them in East Germany was in Leipzig. It was a Lutheran pastor there, Christian Führer. He was one of the candles who had begun a prayer group in 1983. Every Monday they would meet at 5 o'clock in the Nikolaikirche to pray for peaceful change in their country. Well, that seems innocuous enough. So sometimes there are 5 people, sometimes there are 50, year after year, every Monday. Well, about 1989, it begins to heat up a little bit. Now, at this point, any organization you had is penetrated with people from the Stasi. So in a group like this, maybe a third of you would have a tape recorder in your pocket, but nobody would know who's who. And I would get arrested at the end of it and thrown in jail, and that's how they work. Right. So at this event, Christian Führer knows that there are people there, so you have to plan the revolution, if you will, with the enemy in the room. The group gets bigger and bigger, so over the course of '89, after Tiananmen Square, it was clear there was nothing inevitable about peaceful change. The summer gets hotter. More people are beginning to come on the streets, and pretty soon it's 1,000, pretty soon it's 5,000. Well, at this point, the East Germans are really seriously worried. This was about to get out of control. So they put a notice in the newspaper in Leipzig on October 7th, 8th. Not that it matters. Anyway, they said, this insurrection must be put down, and it will, if necessary, with a gun in the hand. They were threatening to use bullets to stop the people who were going to pray for peace. This group of people was very resolute. And on October 9th, Leipzig looked like a war zone. They brought in tanks around the entire center of the city. They flew in thousands of troops in riot gear. They had water cannons, attack dogs, tear gas. All these young recruits had been brought in, and they told them, you will obey an order to shoot, even if you have relatives and friends out there. Even if you have a mother or a sister, you will obey the order to shoot, or you will be shot from behind. Well, these young recruits go back to their barracks and throw themselves down and weep, because they did have sisters and mothers who were going to be out in that group. Nevertheless, as the day goes on, they have flown in hundreds of pints of blood to treat the expected shooting victims. They've warned parents to pick up their children because there will be violence, and it looked for everyone's eyes as though the city was about to break into a civil war. Everyone was afraid. Christian Führer was getting calls all afternoon saying, stop, this is going to end in bloodshed, and you're going to be the person who is responsible for it. In the meantime, thousands of people are on the streets of Leipzig, ashen-faced, really seriously worried, legitimately worried. 70,000 people that evening came all through the streets of Leipzig. All the churches were filled to overflowing, and everybody was terrified. Christian Führer began it on time, and he told them, "Blessed are the peacemakers." They began with the story that told people of peace having an effect and facing down the enemy. And as they are talking to the people there, they're thinking, oh my God, I'm not born to be a martyr, am I? And he addresses that. He said, not everyone is. But for those of you who go out onto the street, do know that you may have the future of your country in your hand, depending on the way you respond tonight. And then he said something interesting happened. As he gave the blessing, the benediction for people to go, he said it was like the time that the Holy Spirit fell on the family of Cornelius in the book of Acts. The Spirit of the Holy Spirit fell and enveloped people there and gave them a sense of purpose and peace. They grabbed each other's elbows. They walked out carrying nothing but a small candle, and they looked at those troops outside, and instead of hating them, they smiled. 70,000 people that evening walked between these walls of soldiers on both sides, peacefully around the ring of Leipzig. 70,000 people. If anybody took up a stone to throw it through a window, someone else took it out and put it down. 70,000 people who peacefully marched around the ring that night. No one gave those troops a reason to shoot. Not one person threw a rock through a window. Not one person knocked off the cap of one of those soldiers. And at the end of the evening, the forces of peace had won. The news got out of this, and it spread all over East Germany. And people began to do this in other cities as well. And by the time it gets to Berlin, 1 million people go out onto the streets. But disciplined, they did not give a provocation to shoot. At this point, the East German leaders realized he had totally lost control. Erich Honecker resigns. The people were speaking with their feet, and they were negotiating with the signs that they were carrying. On November 9th in Leipzig, as 1 million people are on their feet in Berlin, this time in Leipzig, they do a march to commemorate Kristallnacht, the night of violence against the Jews at the beginning of the Second World War. And as they marched through the streets of Leipzig for the 7th time, they asked forgiveness for what the Germans had done to the Jews in the Second World War. And as they marched through Leipzig for the 7th time, the wall in Berlin fell with an echo of that of Jericho. You could say that that was a natural outcome, or you could simply accept that this was miraculous. Nobody expected it. And the border guards in Berlin simply opened up the barriers, and nobody had the will to stop the river of people crossing. Using a little poetic license, you could say that what took 10 years in Poland took 10 months in Hungary, and 10 weeks in Germany, and 10 days in Czechoslovakia, and 10 hours in Romania. But this rolling earthquake, a spiritual and moral earthquake, rumbled across the continent, finally taking down the Soviet Union in the last throes in 1991. As history goes, this is not normally the way revolutions roll out. December of 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev handed in his resignation. 400 million people had been freed, and scarcely a shot was fired. 2 more thoughts. Václav Havel, Czechoslovakia's leader, said he thought he was an agnostic, but in his New Year's Eve address in 1989, he said he had to believe in miracles because he had just lived one. He had been in prison 6 months before as a dissident playwright. Now he was a president of Czechoslovakia. 1989 truly was the Annus Mirabilis, the year of miracles. 30 years later, the culture that we are living in now is increasingly confrontational. No one knows how this will end. I do know that we need new candles. And I challenge the students who are here today, we need you. We need your principled and mature behavior. We need your thoughtfulness. We need your faith. And you need to be able to stand for the truth and burn, regardless of the consequences. And if you do, the darkness will recede. I'll leave you with one last image. The formation of character takes place in the crucible of conflict. Human character is like the formation of coal. It's formed under massive pressure, deep in the earth, over eons of time. It produces two things, either dust or diamonds. Thank you.
Well, we are almost done, everyone. That was an absolutely beautiful speech from Barbara. Thank you so much for that. So as we come to our close, and we will ask Father Simeon Keys to come up in just a moment to lead us in our concluding prayer, I hope that you'll take a chance to look at the donor pledge card that you have in your program. And let me just state that, of course, everything we're doing here as we're trying to demonstrate what we believe is important for our time and our talent and our treasure, that these are critical things, and of course, everything unfortunately costs in this world, and we hope that you'll consider donating to the Free Enterprise Institute. I can assure you that, and I hope that this was obvious this morning, we believe in human dignity, we believe in discussion, we believe in manners, we believe in debate, but we also really believe in truth, and we believe that there are ways to get to that truth. We believe in God, we believe in heroes, we believe in liberty, we believe in virtue, we believe in the free enterprise system, and we believe in America. We hope that you'll join us in advocating all of those things. Thank you. For our concluding prayer, I would like to call up Father Simeon Keys of St. Paul Orthodox Church.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. O Lord our God, calling to remembrance all of those who have been killed as passion bearers in a Christ-like manner, and who have been martyred while under the communist yoke, we ask that you teach us the mystery of what it means for the precious and life-giving cross to be a weapon of peace and a trophy invincible. Be mindful, O Lord, of our President of the United States, of all civil authorities, and of our armed forces, of this city in which we dwell, and of every city and land. Grant us peaceful times, that we, in their tranquility, may lead a calm and tranquil life in all godliness and sanctity. Now, Lord, let us, thou thy servant, depart in peace, according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before the face of all people, a light to enlighten the Gentiles, and the glory of thy people Israel. Amen.
Thank you very much. Have a safe trip to work or to home, wherever you may be. Thank you for being with us.